Okay, we are on part 2 of chapter 7, page 107, if you're following at home. Mr. Reynolds was in the yard bringing in the sows. He heard footsteps behind him, and then Jip was nuzzling his leg. "So, you little devil, you found them then, my dears?" He still had not turned round. "Dogs are like horses, got minds of their own." "We found him, Mr. Reynolds," said Tucky, "and someone else. Look." Mr. Reynolds turned and stared. "Your plane! From your plane, is he?" He could hardly believe what he was looking at. "Jip found him, Mr. Reynolds," said David. "He's a German bomber pilot, Luftwaffe." "I can see that, my dear, I can see that." He looked the German up and down, and then he noticed the revolver David was holding in his hand. "Now you give that here to me, my dear," he said, and he walked around the German, keeping his distance, and took the revolver from David. "Anne," he called out, not taking his eyes off the German. "Anne, come here, come out here." He was pointing the revolver at the German now and waving him towards the cottage. "Your plane must have been your plane, most for certain. You were right, my dears, right after all. Does he speak English?" "No," said Tucky. He was longing to see Anne's face when she saw. "He's limping, isn't he? Course he's been out on the moor for the best part of a week. No, 'twould be more than that now, wouldn't it? Looks half starved, doesn't he, Anne?" Anne threw open the door and came running out, her hands white with flour. She stopped dead and her hand shot to her mouth. "German pilot," Tucky said, "from our plane. We found him on the moor." "Jip found him," David said quickly. "Did he hurt you?" Anne had gone white. "Gentle as a lamb by the look of him," said Mr. Reynolds. "But the gun," said Anne. "The gun, how did you get the gun?" "Just gave himself up," David said. "He can hardly walk. Anne, he's tired out and coughing. He should see a doctor." "The van, my dear, get the van out," said Mr. Reynolds. Here's just the picture. Said Mr. Reynolds. "Take it up to the village and get Captain Starry, and if he's not there, then ring up the army at Oakhampton. They'll send someone out, but be as quick as you can now. We'll look after him here, won't we, my dears?" Anne came closer to the German and looked up into his face. "Just people, just ordinary people like you and me," she said. In the warmth of the kitchen, the German sat in Anne's chair by the stove, holding a mug of tea in his hands and shivering. Mr. Reynolds nursed the revolver, shaking his head. "And the blankets, I don't understand about the blankets," he said slowly. "They're ours, no doubt about that. That green one, I've seen that one on my bed before now, most for certain. 'Twas on my bed for years." "We found all sorts up there," David spoke up confidently. "We brought them all back, the blankets, a bottle of whiskey, and this pillowcase. He must have taken them, come here and taken them." David had thought it all out as they came across the fields, and the story came out now convincingly. Mr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. "And the plane?" he asked. "No sign of the plane, I suppose?" "We looked all around, there was nothing, not a sign." "Crashed into a bog," Tucky blurted out, and David winced. They had agreed David would be the spokesman, but Tucky didn't seem to think that was the case. "How do you know that, my dear?" Mr. Reynolds looked up sharply. "He couldn't have told you. He doesn't speak English, does he?" "He doesn't. No, not really," David said, willing Tucky to keep his mouth shut. "Tucky's just guessing, that's all. Don't see what else could have happened, though. We reckoned it must have crashed and then sank in a bog. That's what we thought, anyway." "Ah," Mr. Reynolds nodded. "There is that, I suppose. 'Tis a possibility, no doubt. And did you see any sign of anyone else up there? Germans, I mean? I was thinking that there's more than one man in a bomber crew, and it was a bomber, wasn't it?" David nodded. The question was too close, and Mr. Reynolds was talking strangely. He was suspicious. David was sure of it. "Now, there's as many as 6 or 8 in one of their bombers. That's as far as I know. Certainly more than one. I wonder what happened to the others." "Dead. They're all dead." It was the German who spoke. David and Tucky looked at him with amazement. "You speak English?" said Tucky. "I speak English," said the German, leaning back in the chair and shutting his eyes. "I speak very good English." And as he did, there was an accent, but it was barely distinguishable. "But I thought," Tucky remembered Mr. Reynolds. That's the first time, Mr. Reynolds, honest. He never said a word in English before, not a word. Mr. Reynolds got up from the table and crouched down by the German's chair. The other men in the plane, he said, are they all dead? All of them, the German said, opening his eyes and looking at Mr. Reynolds. All of them dead. My plane sunk under the ground. There was no time. I could not get them out. And the blankets? Mr. Reynolds held up the one that was drying by the stove. Where did you get these from? David and Tucky held their breath. David felt his nails biting into the palms of his hands, and his heart pounded in his ears. I was cold and I was hungry. He spoke clearly. I stole them. This afternoon and yesterday afternoon I came here. The house was empty. There was no one here. I took blankets, eggs, whiskey, anything I could find. I'm sorry to steal from your house, but when a man is that hungry, he will do anything. I had to eat. Mr. Reynolds straightened up and put his hands on his hips. You were bombing Plymouth last week. I can say nothing about that. The German leant back and closed his eyes again. Well, my dears, Mr. Reynolds was smiling. I'm beginning to understand it now. Jip must have followed him back out on the moor, and I sent you two out after Jip. Well, I'll be blowed. You wouldn't believe it, would you? I'll tell you something. They'll never believe it in the village, my dears, not till they see him anyway. He looked at the German and back at the boys. Well, I'll be blowed. I'll be blowed. The German had cleared them on every count, and the boys could relax for the first time. David was tempted to catch his eye to thank him, but he dared not take the risk. There was no point in spoiling it now, not just for a gesture. He felt Tucky smiling at him confidently, and he ignored him. They were safe, but he felt no triumph, only relief.